Before I begin, I should point out that this is the third part of a three-part series on the far right in Britain. In order to fully understand the context of what is discussed in this video, it may be advisable to watch both preceding videos, but hey, it's up to you. It's strange for me to do a video on the BNP. Most parties I've covered on this channel haven't held a place in my history, and have never been personally significant for me. The BNP, on the other hand, were. I was never a member and never involved in BNP politics, but it was the 22nd of October 2009 that politics first took its hold over me. Nick Griffin appeared on Question Time, a political panel show which airs weekly in the UK. Discussing the issues of the day, weary-eyed politicians feign enthusiasm and disillusioned audience members yawn questions. This was different though. There was a genuine hype and anticipation around this. At the age of 17, I wasn't particularly interested in politics, but that wasn't relevant. We could tune in and see someone almost universally reviled get served. And that's exactly what we got. It was painful. The audience jeered as Griffin awkwardly laughed, fidgeted with discomfort, the pressure clearly getting to him as question after uncomfortable question was levelled and inadequately volleyed back in return. Griffin was one such politician whereby his past statements proved so inflammatory for the majority of Britons that all it took to stump him was for one to simply quote his words back to him. The next day, a friend commented to me, "Did you see it last night then? It was great, wasn't it?" But I couldn't say anything in response. The whole thing felt a bit dirty and uncomfortable. Politicians of all stripes united in a 1-hour unabashed verbal assault. The audience cackled as one member levelled a question to Nick Griffin, and I was left wondering how on earth we got here. Who is this man? What does he believe and what party is he standing for? These questions were basically the beginning of my fascination with right-wing politics throughout Europe. So yeah, this channel that you're watching right now, you can thank Nick Griffin's performance on Question Time for that. Anyway, on with the video. The BNP was formed in 1982 by John Tyndall. As stated in the previous video on the National Front, Tyndall split from the National Front to form the New National Front after disputes with the Directorate following the 1979 elections disaster. Tyndall attempted to push for constitutional reform within the party to consolidate his own power, was rebuked and left. Eventually, this resulted in the formation of the BNP. In terms of differentiating between the BNP and the National Front in this early period, there is very little to do so in terms of policy. Indeed, Tyndall himself emphasised this. British nationalism inherited from the 1970s an ideology that was quite adequate to all demands. Instead, what was needed was a form of organisation that would enable the movement to promote these ideas more effectively. So then, the BNP was formed to mark an organisational shift, which namely consisted of Tyndall wielding all the power without a pesky directorate to answer to or get in the way. This may frame Tyndall as a quasi-dictator, and to be honest, that wouldn't be far from the truth. However, there was some sense to this move. If you've watched my video on the National Front, you'll remember how prone the party was to splits. Tyndall, being the sole source of ideological and strategic authority, served as a bastion to the factionalism that forever plagued the front. Tyndall was reluctant to field candidates. Remember that the BNP was basically formed on the back of the front's electoral catastrophe, and thus Tyndall was hardly salivating at the thought of sticking his neck out once again. Moreover, in 1985 the electoral system was reformed. Now the threshold for reclaiming an election deposit was only 5%, lowered from 12.5%. This sounds good, but the cost of the deposit was increased from £150 to £500. Elections were thus risky and, frankly, unaffordable for small parties. Instead, Tyndall aimed to grow the party and not bother with elections until the party had a reasonable chance of achieving something. For now, the issue was attracting members. Numerous attempts were made at merging the National Front with the BNP, with the then National Front leader Andrew Brons acting as the go-between. However, most in the National Front flag group weren't exactly enamoured with the idea. Tyndall would only allow a merger were he the undisputed head of the party. These plans in the 80s ultimately fell through. Instead, only the odd branch here and there defected to the BNP, the most crucial of which proved to be the Tower Hamlets London branch of the National Front. But we'll get to them later. The 1987 general election wasn't contested by the BNP. This was actually a savvy move. The flag group, in a bid to differentiate themselves from the esoteric political soldiers, wasted what little money they did have on election contests they could never win, and thus essentially bankrupted themselves. The parsimonious BNP, on the other hand, were able to save money, and by 1989 had even purchased the party headquarters. The chief priority was to grow, and truth be told, growth was scarce. Little growth meant little funds, and so the situation needed rectifying. The far right in general experienced a slump throughout this period. By 1983, Margaret Thatcher's second term, one poll found that only 3% of Britons regarded immigration as an important issue. As such, racial nationalism was hardly in an opportune position. Tyndall thus adopted a march and grow approach. He believed that the streets were to be controlled before the ballot, and instead, marches were encouraged that often resulted in violent clashes with local minority communities and political opponents. These forays obviously weren't election winners, but they weren't supposed to be. Instead, they served to position the BNP as the most active and prominent white nationalist party in the country, and by the 1990s, the party had eclipsed the desolated National Front. At some point though, the party had to venture into electoral politics again. Following a state crackdown on public demonstrations, the BNP found it increasingly difficult to march freely. Furthermore, a growing faction of modernisers within the party sought to increase the respectability of the party's image by engaging in community politics. This meant dropping rhetoric about Jews, biological racism, conspiracy theories and Holocaust revisionism, and instead focusing on community-oriented issues, building a grassroots following in local communities. Indeed, the impetus for this came to be found in the Tower Hamlets National Front division that defected to the BNP in the late 80s. As Eddie Butler stated, "We must stop talking about what we like to talk about and start talking about the things the local people are crying out to hear." In 1994, Derek Beacon was elected local councillor in Millwall. This was done through engaging with locals and thus circumventing the ability of other political groups to label the party Nazi or fascist, as such labels would ring disconcordantly with perceptions locals had of the party. Under the slogan of Rights for Whites, the BNP were able to frame themselves as a community force that was standing up for forgotten residents. Door-to-door canvassing and one-to-one engagement with residents was encouraged, while protests, marches and anything that involved confrontation was immediately dropped. Despite the success, it was short-lived. By 1994, the party had lost its seat, partly due to mass mobilisation on the part of Labour and anti-fascist activists to oust the party. Moreover, the growing prominence of Combat 18, a militant neo-Nazi movement, started causing problems for the BNP. Originally formed to protect BNP members from anti-fascist activists, the group eventually came to be a law unto themselves and increasingly came into violent confrontation with party members. Combat 18 decried the efforts of the modernisers, and this actually proved pretty attractive for many BNP members. Remember, the BNP at this point was still not a family party. Its grassroots were still young, male and excitable, and no doubt found the prospects of rucking with the Reds more alluring than talking to the elderly or handing out leaflets bemoaning the cutting of council services. Indeed, the effects of Combat 18 on the BNP were so dire that Tyndall himself had to confront the issue in Spearhead. In a scathing article entitled "Doing the Enemy's Work," Tyndall opined Combat 18 to be the work of the state to undermine the BNP. Tyndall pointed to the extremist nature of C18 publications, their use of violence and lack of prosecution to justify this. He wrote, "For myself, I can see no logical reason whatever for this failure to prosecute the C18 people, other than that it suits the establishment to keep C18 in existence. And why should it do so, other than to enable C18 to be used as a weapon for damaging, and if possible destroying, the British National Party?" To an outsider, this certainly may seem fanciful. However, there was something fishy about C18. Nick Lowles claimed throughout the 90s that MI5 had the BNP well infiltrated, and C18 were certainly a useful tool for the state to tear the far right asunder. The emergence of C18 also had another unintended consequence. Tyndall buckled down on his extreme right rhetoric to prove to the party base that Combat 18's claims that the party was softening were moot. This essentially took all the progress made by the modernisers and cast it aside. Many influential members of the party stood aghast. The mid-1990s were a good time for the European radical right. The FPÖ in Austria, under the direction of Haider, were making serious inroads, had moderated their image and were eventually to find their way into government come 1999. Vlaams Belang in Belgium were gaining very high levels of support among the Flemish regions of Belgium, and the Front National in France were on the ascendance. This was all happening in tandem with the moderation of policies and a cleaner, more respectable public image. The BNP, however, were late to cotton on to this. Ironically, one aspect of the pushback and knuckling down on ideological purity was Tyndall's embrace of Nick Griffin. Griffin had joined the BNP in 1994 and was a stalwart against moderation. For Griffin, the success in Millwall was nothing to do with moderation, but instead due to the willingness of the party to protect its white residents with well-directed boots and fists. Griffin espoused the primary importance of pursuing Holocaust revisionism and even published a pamphlet in 1997 entitled Who Are the Mindbenders?, discussing the Jewish role in British media. Curiously though, things were about to change. Griffin almost overnight enacted an about turn. Perhaps it was an epiphany, perhaps rabid opportunism, to be honest probably both. Griffin spotted the increasing distress amongst the rank and file, the continual floundering and flunking of the party at the ballot, the upward gradient of rightist parties throughout Europe. In 1999 he was to compete for BNP leadership, and he was to do so under a banner of moderation, and was to win. Tyndall won barely 30% of the vote. It was a landslide. How was Griffin to do this though? It was only a couple of years ago that members were defecting to Combat 18, claiming that the BNP wasn't extreme enough. Well, Griffin emphasised time and time again that the change was purely cosmetic. He wrote, "Politics is always the art of the possible, so we must judge every policy by one simple criterion. Is it realistically possible that a decisive proportion of the British people will support it? If not, then to scale down our short-term ambitions to a point at which the answer becomes yes. It's not a sellout, but the only possible step closer to our eventual goal." Party rhetoric became oriented around four central policy pillars: freedom, democracy, identity and security, and the party embarked on its quest for legitimacy. Unfortunately for Tyndall, this involved his being sidelined. Spearhead was dropped as the party's official newspaper, being replaced by the BNP's new glossy magazine, Identity, undoubtedly influenced by the Front National's magazine in France of the same name. He also started an annual party festival, the Red, White and Blue, again influenced by the Front National. The aim was to present the party as a thoroughly respectable, family-focused party that British people could turn to. Griffin's moderation was to pay off. The party drastically changed its strategy and found a happy medium. Tyndall had basically eschewed electoral politics altogether and had wished to retain a hardline ideology that would have proved most alienating to the majority of people. The National Front flag group competed as many elections as possible, all of which it couldn't possibly have won, and so just turned the party into a massive flop. The BNP under Griffin, on the other hand, concentrated on specific wards where there was already extant support. These would subsequently be canvassed heavily, a strong local presence built, focused on local issues and community politics. This would then be capitalised upon throughout local elections to council seats, where turnout was usually lower and moreover, the presence of the traditional parties was notably apathetic. The basic idea was, local presence would increase, legitimacy would be gained with it, and this would eventually enable the BNP to compete in general elections for positions in Parliament under the notoriously difficult first-past-the-post system. Despite never winning any parliamentary seats, to be honest, this proved a winning formula. Moreover, it hugely curtailed the activism of the traditional parties and anti-fascists. It was difficult to convince local residents that the BNP were Nazis when only a few hours prior a perfectly reasonable, respectable and pleasant BNP activist had been at the door conversing about the problems of the area and how to improve them. Local campaigns often focused on racism against white residents and paranoia over asylum seekers. Oldham in the 2001 general elections prove a useful example, as would Burnley. In January, the police chief superintendent of Oldham voiced his concerns about increasing attacks against white residents by Asian gangs. The BNP gained local exposure by engaging in activities demanding equal rights for whites, echoing their Millwall campaign of the early 90s. Furthermore, greater local legitimacy for their message was gained as the local newspaper, the Oldham Chronicle, continually voiced concern over racism amongst the Asian population towards whites. Increased and inflamed tensions in the town eventually overspilled and resulted in a riot between Asian youths and the police, inflamed by National Front and Combat 18 activists that the BNP maintained a healthy distance from. In the end, the BNP obtained 1 in 6 votes in the constituency, which laid a perfect foundation for the council elections the following year. By 2004, the party could lay claim to 5 council seats and became the most successful far-right party in British history. The party competed in the Euro elections of 2004, almost certain it would take a couple of seats in the European Parliament and the lucrative salaries that would come with it. Hopes were dashed, but still the party obtained a respectable number of votes, over 800,000. Indeed, these elections saw the party tilt its focus from race to Islam. Its European election party broadcast was introduced by a Sikh man, saying he was voting BNP to help curtail the spread of Islamic extremism. It should also be noted that the general climate in Britain was changing. Immigration was once again becoming a potent issue thanks to Tony Blair and New Labour drastically increasing the number of new arrivals. On top of this, New Labour abandoned its traditional base of working class voters and instead focused on Middle England and immigrant communities. This meant that small industrial towns with poor white working class populations became both forgotten and transformed. Ethnic division grew and long-standing residents shifted electoral allegiance from Labour, who came to be seen as the party for new arrivals, to either the BNP or just ceased to vote altogether. Michael Howard, then Tory leader, built his 2005 campaign around immigration and curbing it. His slogan became, "It's not racist to impose limits on immigration," which actually serves to legitimise the message of the BNP and hardly improved the Tories' prospects in the aforementioned working class bastions, who had a scanty history of ever supporting the Tories. The BNP was on the ascendant and public fascination was growing. Indeed, previously the British media had more or less cordoned off the coverage of far-right parties under a policy of no platform. However, this was gradually dropped. In 2001, Griffin was invited onto BBC Hard Talk and grilled about his views on the Holocaust and race in Britain. He was frequently interviewed on news segments about the party and election analysis chit-chat. I should point out that the coverage was hardly favourable, but Griffin is no idiot and was able to articulate himself fairly well at times, and readily claimed that his exposure only bolstered party support. Another high-profile media report entitled The Secret Agent featured a reporter going undercover and secretly recording BNP members brag about attacks on Asians, and even ended up in an attempted prosecution of Griffin and then head of publicity, Mark Collett. Both were found not guilty. Collett himself was no stranger to the media by this point. He had appeared in 2 relatively high-profile documentaries. One was hosted by Russell Brand and entitled Nazi Boy, in which Collett labelled gays AIDS monkeys. Another was dubbed Young, Nazi and Proud and featured Collett comparing himself to Hitler, remarking that Nazi Germany was preferable to modern-day Bradford and Burnley, and bemoaning the fact that a blonde girl kissed a black man in a nightclub. This was basically the problem the BNP had. Nick Griffin couldn't afford to throw off the hardliners because the party basically depended on them. He stated, "We can't afford to just alienate everyone from the past or who regard themselves as principled nationalists. We simply can't afford to do that. The organisational costs would be too catastrophic." The result was that if the media wished to show images of party members Hitler saluting, for example, it need not have looked very far. Moreover, because Griffin had overtly stated on numerous occasions, time and time again, that the party's moderation was purely cosmetic, all the media had to do was quote his own words back at him to undermine his platform entirely. When Griffin replied with, "We're not a racist party," well, it became difficult to believe. This all came to the fore on the eve of the 22nd of October 2009. By this point, the party had managed to secure a seat on the General London Assembly and had won 2 seats in the European elections earlier that year. Nick Griffin was on question time and simply was unable to defend himself. How could he? Confronted with past speeches, this one in particular alongside David Duke, he had nothing to say. There's a difference between selling out your ideas and selling your ideas. The BNP isn't about selling out its ideas, which are your ideas too, but we are determined now to sell them, to use the saleable words freedom, security, identity, democracy. Nobody can criticise them. Perhaps one day, when we've got ourselves in a position where we control the British broadcasting media, they might change their mind and say every last one must go. So instead of talking about racial purity, we talk about identity. Indeed, Griffin's response when these quotes were put to him was that he was attempting to prevent David Duke from leading these young activists astray. Needless to say, people were unconvinced. This was the beginning of the end for the party. About this time, the group was under increasing pressure from the Equality and Human Rights Commission to amend their constitution to allow non-white members into the party. This change was adopted in 2010. Then followed rampant accusations of financial misconduct and criticism of Griffin's dictatorial control over the party. Remember, the initial purpose of the BNP was for Tyndall to consolidate power, and thus it functioned under a kind of Führer principle, whereby absolute authority was bestowed to the leader. Griffin never reformed this, which, when the going got tough and criticism of Griffin mounted, became a central gripe of the party base. Andrew Bronze, fellow MEP and long-time activist, attempted a leadership bid against Griffin, promising increased democratisation. It failed and Bronze left the party in 2012. In 2014, the party lost its only seat in the European Parliament, and Griffin lost a leadership bid to Adam Walker and was subsequently expelled the following year. The party now is, well, barely existent, with only one councillor to its name, set to retire in 2018. The BNP is kind of a tragic case. There were undoubtedly thousands of people associated with the party in some way that saw it as a genuine alternative to the establishment parties that had let them down. For many, it was like a protest against New Labour, the party that was supposed to be their voice that had utterly abandoned them in favour of newly imported constituents. At the same time, the BNP was unable to shake off the Nazi ghost because in many cases that was its animating spirit. Is this to say that the party was always a covert extremist operation? Well, it's hard to tell, but if one wished to construct that narrative, it was hardly difficult to do so, and at the same time the party could not afford to make it harder to do so. It desperately needed activists, and these activists often had shady backgrounds but were utterly necessary to engage in the labour-intensive community politics that became the BNP's trademark. In the end, the party collapsed basically under its own contradictions. However, it did clear the way for another, more respectable outfit to gain traction, to steal its trademark policy points only without the baggage of Nazi uniforms and history, drawing on a different ideological tradition altogether, one that could appeal to both working class and Tories alike. It's been a long time coming, but finally, we will come to UKIP. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked the video, don't forget to click like and please subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't, click dislike, leave a comment and tell me where I went wrong. As always, huge thank you to all of my Patreons. It's thanks to you guys that these videos are regular. If it's within your means to do so and you like what I do, please do consider becoming a patron yourself. Anyway, as always guys, thanks a lot and until next time.